I would like to introduce your moderator for the session, Beth Keck, who is a familiar face in these diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations. This is actually the fourth webinar that Beth has moderated for Rotary over the past 2 years. She is passionate about many things, but has given countless hours to make sure Rotary is living up to its values and making space for everyone to be included. So welcome, Beth.
Thank you, Leanne, and thanks to all of you who are coming from around the world. It's wonderful watching the chat and everybody identifying all the different parts of the world that you are tuning into today. My name again is Beth Keck. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm a member of the Rotary Club of Bentonville, Arkansas in the USA. Today, I speak from my home in Bentonville, which is on the traditional lands of the Osage, Quapaw, and Caddo tribes. And although the landscape around here has drastically changed, I want to acknowledge their thousands of years of stewardship and the relationship that these Native Americans have with this land. We use Indigenous land acknowledgements as a way for all of us to recognize the enduring relationship that Indigenous people have with their traditional territories. As Leanne mentioned, today's webinar is part of a series that we have had this past year on the many aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Over the past year, we have explored how unconscious bias can impact relationships. We've looked at the value of connecting with diverse communities. We've talked about race and identities, and we have learned about microaggressions and how they can affect our relationships and our club culture. Today, we're going to explore another facet of diversity, that of disabilities. There is research from the World Health Organization that says that 15% of the people in our world experience some form of disability, making people with disabilities the largest minority group in the world. And so today, what we're going to look at is some of the assumptions around people with disabilities, look at practical solutions for making experiences in our club, in our communities accessible to everyone. And then recognizing that sometimes when we approach this, that we need to broaden our perspective and not just rely upon our own preconceptions. In this series of webinars, we've talked to people with various identities, LGBTQ, Black, young leaders, and a key takeaway has been the importance of asking and allowing people to express how they would like to be identified. So for our introduction of our panelists today, I would like to ask each of you to please introduce yourself and indicate how you would like to be identified. And we'll begin with our colleague, Rotarian colleague, Mark. Mark is, I believe, coming to us from Canada. Mark, do you want to come on?
Yes, thank you very much, Beth. Hello, and thank all of you for joining us today. I am coming to you from Toronto, Canada, and the Rotary Club of Whitby Sunrise. I am deaf. I was born deaf, and I identify as deaf. I rely on lip reading, or speech reading, as it is called in some parts of the world, and technology to communicate. For the past 25 years, my wife Valerie and I owned a chain of restaurants in Toronto. We recently sold the business, but during our years of operation, we employed almost 250 workers with disabilities, or 17% of our workforce. Today, I am a human rights activist, a DEI specialist, and advisor to the Government of Canada.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for that background that you're bringing to our discussion today. Jeremy, I believe you're coming from Cape Town, South Africa.
Thank you, Beth. Yes, indeed. I come from the beautiful city of Cape Town in South Africa. I belong to the Newlands Rotary Club, District 9350. I'm a relatively new Rotarian, only inducted last year. And I am blind and a diversity practitioner specializing in disability inclusion, which I've been doing for the last 22 years.
Thank you, Jeremy, and also thank you for bringing your expertise. And we are so glad that you have found Rotary and become an active Rotarian. And our third panelist today is Dr. Maria de Mello, who's Brazilian, but I believe she's in the UAE today. So Maria?
Hi, everyone. I am an occupational therapist, and nowadays I am living in Abu Dhabi, UAE, and I have been working with assistive technology since '93. And actually, my passion is advocacy for the rights of persons with disabilities. And I do believe the right use of assistive device is a very important dimension in doing that. Thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you, Maria. So when we were organizing this webinar, we had a question when you registered, and we had about 1,000 people register, and everyone who registers is going to get a video of this as well. And we asked you to indicate of the common barriers for disability inclusion, what were the biggest barriers in your community? And we got some very interesting results. About a third of you said that it was the lack of assistive technology and inaccessible physical environments. A quarter of our participants said attitudes and assumptions. 15% focused in on the lack of systems and policies, and a quarter of us said we really didn't know. So with this webinar, we would like to start by looking at each of these common barriers and learning more about them. And so, Maria, I'd like to start with you today. And if you could take about 5 minutes and just tell us about the issues, the barriers around having relevant assistive technology, which is your area of expertise, and then, of course, accessibility of physical environments.
As I said, I have been working with assistive technology since '93. And so I am kind of following the trends of this field in the world. And what we see that most advanced technology we have really a lot of devices, but the problem that we deal daily is not about the devices. It's about the process, how to select and how to prescribe the right device for the right persons. And one of the things that's very important is usually people believe that assistive technology is very expensive, always. It's not like that. I had the opportunity to work with very poor people to very rich people. And we can create devices, can solve problems with all kinds of resources if you have the knowledge to make it. And so I do believe the information about what assistive technology is available and which one is best for each case is very important. In the same way, accessibility is a concept. For me, aptitude is much more the environmental accessibility. We do have to consider accessibility in all environments, in all of our practice in the world. And in addition to it, I would like us to start to think about not only accessibility, but also about universal design. And so the three concepts must be together: assistive technology, universal design, and accessibility. And the knowledge of these three concepts must be spread all around the world and as much as possible.
Thank you very much, Maria. And that gives us, I think, a very good overview of some of the areas that we need to look at in our communities. Mark, attitudes and assumptions about people with disabilities was another area that's often a barrier. And with your work, the work that you and Valerie have done with your restaurants and 250 employees with disabilities, that's so impressive. Tell us about, please tell us about these assumptions. And I believe we need our Chinese interpreter to go on mute, please.
Okay, thank you, Beth. Personally, I'm not surprised to hear that 25% of respondents indicated that they didn't know about the common barriers facing disabled people, both in our communities and indeed in our local Rotary Club. Because quite fairly, we don't know what we don't know. Although some barriers appear to be obvious, such as steps for a wheelchair user or audible instructions to a deaf person, the overarching barrier to the disabled in terms of inclusion and accessibility are actually attitudinal. The attitude of our society, the attitude of our authorities, the attitude of employers, and much, much more. Now, Valerie and I made a conscious decision to include the disability community in our hiring practices when we began our journey as business owners. We employed workers with every type of disability and in every single position, which at one time was filled by a worker with a disability. And that includes positions in senior management. Many of them became our best employees. They stayed longer, they worked in a more safe manner, they had far more innovative attitudes because of the fact that their lived experience included a far different set of problem-solving skills. Now, there's much more to this, but there was a clear and obvious business case to inclusion. Inclusion was clearly good for my business, as it would be for Rotary clubs. We had so much success including workers with disabilities that other companies began to take notice. And this actually led to a second career for me as a global keynote speaker and advisor to government. However, very often I run into resistance when speaking about inclusion of disabled people in employment or in Rotary clubs, and you will too, because so many non-disabled people, through a combination of unconscious bias and lack of awareness, simply buy wholesale into a series of myths and misperceptions and stereotypes. And these stereotypes include, but are not limited to, that potential Rotary members with disabilities can't contribute, will not show up often for club meetings, can't afford Rotary, or will need too much help. This is where attitudes become the greatest barrier. And counterintuitively, the opposite to these myths and stereotypes happens to be true. That is a fact. Attitudes, although annoying, can lead to some humorous situations. So I'll give you an example of that. I happen to fly a lot, so I book my flights online and I indicate that I'm deaf. More often than not, when I get to the airport, the airline staff have showed up with a wheelchair. It happens often. Attitudes. So I sort of make light of this, and I tell them very loudly, well, I've had a miraculous recovery since I booked the flight, but now I can't hear anything. So sometimes they laugh nervously. Other times they are obviously quite uncomfortable, but always they learn about the attitude. Now in Canada, according to our government branch of statistics, 22% of us are disabled, 1 in 5. That number will climb to 1 in 4 by 2030 as a result of age-related disabilities. We are clearly living longer. This increased longevity actually poses an issue for some Rotary clubs. As current members slowly become unable to walk up or down steps, hear a speaker, or see well enough to navigate a poorly laid out building, the attitude towards the disabled actually starts right here with your current members. You get that right, and the door open to welcoming disabled members of your community into your Rotary clubs.
Thank you, Mark. And also thank you for that wonderful example of how our personal preconceptions can make us stumble and how we need to be much more broader in our awareness. Jeremy, let's turn to you. And in your practice, you are an expert in terms of systems and policies from the global level down to the national level, South Africa, and local level, and as a Rotarian. So I would love to hear from you about that particular barrier.
Thank you, Beth. You see, it's an interesting thing with systems and policies, is that without them, you will have very little exposure to disability. So therefore, there is an absolute essential need to incorporate some form of systemic acknowledgement of disability, and that you need procedures and policies in order to be able to rectify many of the barriers and obstacles that are facing any society, whether it's a national or provincial or local or even a local Rotarian club. And so what is important here is to understand that one has to plan. And there's that old saying, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And so we need systems, clear, unambiguous systems to demonstrate and show us which way we should go in this particular aspect of inclusion. Now, we're coming from a particularly compromised societal issue such as disability, which has been largely invisible and rendered invisible for time immemorial. And so there's very little understanding of what is required in terms of allowing persons with disabilities to have fair and equal inclusion into society. And so we can't rely on that alone. So we have to spell it out in these procedural ways. And that is often done by legislation through companies, through countries, such as in America, you've got your ADA, your Americans with Disabilities Act. In England, you've got the DDA, the Disabilities Discrimination Act. And many countries have similar legislation. Now, here's an interesting problem, is that just having legislation alone or signing a convention such as the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities doesn't guarantee transformation. And this is a mistake, unfortunately, that many people make, regardless where they live in the world, is that just by signing something, they seem to think that, well, we've signed this now, therefore we are somehow implicitly accessible or transformed, and that unfortunately isn't the case. And I think if I can take an example from gender equity or gender diversity, you know, women only got the vote in the early 20s. And so one could be forgiven for thinking, well, you got the vote, now everything should be fine after that. And as any woman will tell you, that's absolutely couldn't be further from the truth. And that glass ceiling is absolutely really there. And so what it demonstrates is that you cannot rest on your laurels, that procedures and policies will do the work for you. So what's needed is you have to have processes which hold the people accountable. And so unless you've got that balance of accountability with your policies and procedures, it won't succeed. But having said that, you do need to systemically, it doesn't matter whether it's your company or your country, you must systemically acknowledge disability, and you acknowledge that it exists. You acknowledge that there are such things as barriers. You acknowledge that barriers need to be removed. And you acknowledge that there needs to be outcomes, those outcomes, but you need to have accountability for those barriers to be demonstrably removed. And so in Rotary, we can definitely look at this by incorporating more finely cut procedurals and policies that incorporate the idea of disability inclusion.
Thank you, Jeremy, for giving us that really excellent overview, starting globally, coming right down. And I really love the saying you said, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And I want to make a note that our very first webinar in this series in September was called Design an Inclusive Plan for Your Organization. And it was all about talking specifically about creating plans so that you can welcome everyone into Rotary. So thank you for that. As I mentioned earlier, the WHO data indicates about 15% of the people worldwide experience some form of disability. Mark has given us the statistics for Canada, which are even more. And so now that we've learned about these barriers, why would it make sense for us to address inclusion of people with disabilities in Rotary? And Maria, I'd like to start with you, and we'll just take about 3 minutes each for this question.
Thank you again. The point is, we most of, I could say almost all families has a member in some age, in some point, with a type of disability. And as Rotary is a open club, I mean, and hosts people from different nationalities and ways to live and so on, should be as inclusive as could as our society. And so in Rotary Club is really very important to be able to receive and to present environment, and not only physical environment, but attitudes, like we could see Mark speaking and Jeremy telling us here before, should be ready to receive all kind of diversity, all kind of people and disabilities. And one thing that we must point out, that there is a lot of invisible disabilities, not only physical disabilities. I just read a message here, one question, one person asking how to include autistic person with no oral communication in the Rotary Club, how to deal with this situation. Some people believe that having technology would solve the problem, but much more important than technology is our attitude and how to deal with this situation. And so there is some ways, some techniques and some information. And as I said before, always information, learn about the behaviors and how to deal. They are different. They are not better nor worse than us, just different than us. And that's it, yes.
That's a wonderful example of a concrete example. And I want to point out that we do have a Rotary group that is a resource group in this area that we can all go to. And I think that's a good example. Jeremy, tell us why you feel like Rotary should be open to people with disabilities.
Thank you, Beth. Why should Rotary include persons with disabilities? It just seems bizarre that they wouldn't. Now, I don't believe for a moment that there's a Rotary club in the world that explicitly excludes persons with disabilities. The fact is, though, is that because people with disabilities tend to be invisible, and that's just something we have inherited over generations and generations in society, that people with disabilities don't show up in society as much as they do, as much as able-bodied people do. And there's reasons for that, and those are barrier related. And we've spoken about that. But the point about Rotary is that it doesn't always realize that these people can make a significant contribution. In my own experience, my own Rotary club, for instance, now has learned something by having a blind Rotary member. Particularly an outspoken Rotary member like me, who has some knowledge of the issues of inclusion. And so they have gained, I believe, by knowing how to deal with things which would implicate me. So one example would be, for instance, when they show videos now. So my club and my district are much more aware now, so that when videos are shown in conferencing, very often you'll have a video with music, and then it's very beautiful to watch and listen to with music, but it doesn't show anything to me. And so what they're encouraged to do now is to have some sort of narration accompanying that. And so people are aware of that. So when we have guests, they're told, listen, we have a blind member. Make sure that you speak through your PowerPoint presentations. Now, everybody learns from that. And that is a wonderful way of inculcating diversity. And lastly, I think what's very important about Rotary getting closer to disability is that as much as Rotary is extraordinarily generous and expansively munificent in what they do in the world, being closer to the concept of disability might inform them about some of the things that they do in societies, which they might be able to do better when they have a greater level of information. The flip side of that is that very often generous donations might be done in a rather stereotypic way without understanding the nuance of what is actually required. but by having greater information, by having greater exposure to disability, I think will far better prepare Rotary to be able to be as generous as they are, but with a much more nuanced effectiveness.
Thank you for that. And also thank you for sharing the kinds of accommodations that you have requested. And it sounds like it's been pretty simple to for this to happen so that you can be included and have a more inclusive atmosphere in your club and district. That's really wonderful news. Mark, let's move to you. What do you think about Rotary and people with disabilities?
Well, I think, Beth, that there is a business case for this. We have to ask ourselves that question. Is there a business case for including disabled people from our community in our Rotary clubs? What about club presidents, district governors, community leaders who have disabilities, already have all those skills? Well, yes, of course there is. There is a definite business case. Just as there is a clear business case for the inclusion of the disabled in meaningful employment, so too are similar specific outcomes that can benefit all of our clubs and our brand. First of all, we would be including new members with an entirely different set of problem-solving skills. And this is where innovative ideas come from. This is going to show up in membership drives. This is going to show up in fundraising, just to name a few. And it includes the fact there will be an increase in overall club engagement. Secondly, by ensuring we include and accommodate prospective new members with disabilities, we become more aware of the needs of current club members who, based largely on age, may now struggle to attend regular meetings. But as well, we have to look at this from a brand perspective as well. If we don't embrace those from all walks of life, including the disabled in our societies, other service organizations might do so if they happen to recognize the benefits of inclusion before we do. Competitive advantage. Thousands of clubs around the world have programs, have partnerships, and have initiatives related to the disabled, especially disabled children. They are wonderful, wonderful initiatives. And in my opinion, they're absolutely critical all the fantastic work we do. But these initiatives can sometimes leave those without disabilities with the mindset or opinion that disabled people require assistance in everything that we do. Although not true, it is understandable considering the largely altruistic thinking that clubs have today. And I don't mean that as a criticism, it's simply a fact. Now, however, we have to take a look at inclusion through possibly a different lens, one that not only benefits the potential club member with a disability, but one which clearly benefits your clubs.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for laying out, I think, a very clear business case for Rotary to tackle this issue of inclusion from a disability viewpoint. Let's move on. Actually, before we move on, Mark, I do want to ask if you have any advice on accommodation from, bringing people into Rotary.
Well, actually, I'm glad you asked that, Beth, because I know that there's many people on this webinar today who half an hour into the webinar are saying to themselves, how do we make this work in our club? And you have to think about this. The simple answer is you don't know. We don't know because we haven't invited somebody with a disability. So you don't know what their needs are yet. So when Valerie and I were operating our business, for 25 years, we were Tim Horton franchisees. And in that time, we always used a practice known as ATP, ask the person. We didn't make the decision for a disabled person. We would ask them, what are your requirements? What are your needs? When we interviewed them for the job and we thought this is the person for the job, we would say to them, what can we do? What can we change? How can we make you more successful as an employee? That's exactly how it works at Rotary. You have somebody in a wheelchair, you have somebody who's deaf, ask them, ATP, what can we do to make sure your contribution in Rotary is the same as everybody else?
That is a wonderful rule of thumb. ATP, ask the person. And thank you, Mark, for that very clear suggestion. Let's now move on to another component of this webinar, and let's talk about benefits. And how does accessibility have a benefit to everyone? And Jeremy, I'd like to start with you. I think you have a really great perspective on this from a human rights point of view. Could you share that with us?
Indeed. So, accessibility is a most underappreciated, misunderstood term. The concept of access, people don't often realize how important it is. And when it comes to persons with disabilities, this is crucial because there are so many elements of accessibility and implicating a myriad types of persons with disabilities that it potentially can get confusing, but it doesn't need to be. So the thing about access is that it's all about barriers. It's all about barriers. So I'll put it to you that there's no such thing as certainly physical accessibility. And the reason for that is because access didn't make itself. Access is due to barriers, and barriers are made by people. Now, in terms of accessibility in Rotary, for instance, you could actually look at a club level and ask yourself, well, how accessible is my club physically? But then you need to also think about persons with other kinds of disabilities, for instance, such as vision disabilities like mine. And you've got to ask yourself, how accessible is our digital space in Rotary? Rotary has an extraordinarily large and very dense web presence. And there are unfortunately still quite a lot of issues from a blind perspective in terms of navigating that digital presence. And that's just from a blind perspective. But then you've got to think about people who might have dyslexia. Now, an enormous number of persons actually have dyslexia. And they struggle in many ways, very much like persons with partial sight or low vision do on very busy, colorful websites. And so accessibility is by no means just an issue around physical things such as ramps and lifts, etc. We must start taking into account the issue around the digital space, particularly now that we have that really embraced digital communication in the way we've had to. And so access is something that, from a human rights point of view, is crucial to bring in the forefront of people's consciousness more and more, because there's very real exclusion as a result of inaccessibility.
Thank you. And thank you for that perspective as well. Maria, do you want to add on to this from the human rights point of view? And then also, I'd appreciate it if you would also address the benefits that come from inclusive design and universal accessibility.
Thank you. One point that I would like to say is one reason why it's so important for us to have the Rotary clubs accessible, that we didn't tell about today yet, that we are aging, and a lot of people who are associated with the clubs, they are in aging process, they are advancing the aging. As we age, we can start to have some disabilities. It's part of aging process. So we always have to think about it. And thinking about human rights, for me, human rights is the right to have the same opportunity to perform all human activities in all environments that human beings are. And when we have an environment, as Jeremy said very well, could be a virtual environment, could be a physical environment, it has to give all the same opportunity to participate in all activities. And as Mark said before, we should ask the person, what do you need? But before we ask the person, we could try to assure that we have the environment as much accessible as possible. There is a lot of information available to help us to transform even the virtual or physical or attitudinal environment the most accessible possible. And so universal design or inclusive environment is an environment where we give to all just the same opportunities to participate in all activities that we perform in that place or in that club or whatever. And when we don't do that, for me, it's a kind of disrespect. We're not respecting that person because we are not giving her the opportunity to be the best that she can be with, or she or he can be with us.
That's great. And thank you for expanding upon the human rights component as well. Mark, before we turn to the audience questions, I'd just like to get your perspective on this, as how Rotarians are responding to the opportunity of including people with disabilities. How do you see us responding?
Okay, I'd like to respond to that with the topic of retention, Beth. But before I do that, I just want to address something that's come up in the chat box a few times, and that is the fact that I am referring to disabled people. In North America, we choose to use person first language, or we choose identity first language. It is the choice of the person who is disabled to do so. I, as a disabled man, choose identity first language, which means I identify myself as disabled. It doesn't define me, but it's part of who I am. So I hope that answers the question that has come up in the chat box to some people from around the world. But retention, and this is such an important question, Beth, because retention in Rotary clubs, especially in North America, is a problem. How can we help to fix that? Well, one way is to tap into the massive, but mostly underutilized talent pool of community members who have a disability. People who today are largely ignored by Rotary clubs. And again, that's not a criticism, rather it's a simple fact. Those old age stereotypes and attitudes really are difficult to break. The reality, however, is simple. Including the disabled in Rotary clubs and engaging them in everything we do, including a leadership position, improves retention. How? The first is that these new club members with disabilities, are often marginalized throughout their everyday lives, often living without social interaction. Rotary club membership and engagement changes that. These new members will remain as members. Secondly, non-disabled people always want to live in inclusive societies, and that goes for Rotary as well. Members are more likely to remain with Rotary and their club if it attracts members who represent the fabric of their community. As well, increased awareness and accessible needs ensures that these long-term club members who become disabled have a better opportunity to remain as active members as awareness removes barriers. But there's one piece of data that all of us need to be aware of. Although 15 to 18% of global citizens are known to have a disability, when we add in a disabled individual's immediate family member, so we're talking about a father, a mother, a brother, a sister, or a son and a daughter, we are now at 65% of the population. When Valerie and I owned our business, we had about 14,000 customers a day. More than 7,000 of them were directly affected by disability. Either they had one or they had a loved one at home with a disability. And this is a number none of us can afford to ignore. Clubs ignore the sheer size and scope of the world's largest minority group at their own peril. Inclusion, therefore, ensures retention.
Thank you, Mark, and also for really making us even more broadly aware about the families that are involved as well. And your statistics about your restaurant really bring this home to us. I'd now like to open up for questions, and our Rotary International colleague, Leanne C. Wright, will be joining us to help us navigate through your questions today. Leanne?
Thanks, Beth, and thanks to our panelists. This has been a great conversation. So many good ideas exchanged in the chat. A reminder to attendees that you can submit your question via Q&A, but I'd also love for you to feel free to share ideas that you have for making your clubs accessible, and I'll share some of those as well. So Mark, first question goes to you. A lot of people in registration actually wanted to know about lowering dues as a way to accommodate people with disabilities. What are your views on that?
Interestingly, Anne, because we do get that question quite often. We need to be cautious about making generalizations about any marginalized group, because of course, this is how stereotypes are created. Many disabled people in the community do have the ability to support themselves. They don't require fees reduction. Instead, they require an invitation. Having said that, it is true that a large part of the world's disabled live in poverty, including wealthy countries like ours here in Canada. Some of our laws, in fact, keep people in poverty, and we have to keep that in mind. I have for a long time encouraged clubs to find innovative ways to include those who may not be able to afford the cost of membership. This is not just for potential memberships with disabilities. We have to think about perhaps, a young single mother with so much to contribute, but has no means in which to join Rotary. So we have to look at some of these types of ideas. And I have seen some great initiatives around the world that are being designed to include people who otherwise would not be able to afford to do so.
Thank you, Mark, for bringing that up. And someone reports that their Rotary Club meets on the first story of a hotel without lifts or elevators. And this person says that they're going to raise the question of inclusion and accessibility with their club. So that is an awesome first step. Thank you. Next question. Let me go to Maria, because I wonder if you have a feeling about broadband internet, especially as it relates to accessibility in some of the more rural areas.
The rural areas, did you say? Yes, yes, okay. I don't have any experience with Rotary Club in rural areas, but I do have worked with some people with disabilities in remote areas, in rural areas. It's really, it's much more difficult, but usually the communities, they are much more open, and the attitudes usually are different than in the big cities. They try to help in the way that they can. And considering the assistive device, they create a lot of solutions that we can even imagine to solve the mobility problems and to adjust the daily living needs of the people with disability living in rural areas. But it's a problem, and we must consider it. And I do believe Rotary clubs, they have the power to maybe develop projects to help to develop these people and to help them to solve the problems that they do have, because they do need help, even to access the assistive technology or the rehabilitation services to improve the functional skills and things like that. So Rotary clubs can make a huge difference for the life of people with disabilities living in rural areas.
Thank you, Maria. Jeremy, question for you. How do we handle missteps? Either saying the wrong thing, maybe not asking the person. This person specifically says, language is evolving, and what was maybe okay to say 10 years ago is not the same thing that you can say, yesterday. So what are your thoughts on how to handle when we don't always get it right?
Thank you. Thanks, Leanne. I'm smiling because you're right. Language expectations have changed, and with disability, there are do's and don'ts. There are some certain categorical things you simply can't say anymore, and you should never have said in the first place. And things have changed. But I'm smiling because my generation, we're a little less politically correct when it comes to terminology around disability. And so I do think that sometimes people need to lighten up a little and not panic quite as much. There are very few people with disabilities out there that are intrinsically angry and that will actually bite your head off. That will happen, and there invariably are some, but by no means is that the norm. And people are often frightened to even engage with people with disabilities because they're actually frightened that they're going to say something wrong. And actually, I think people with disabilities will cut them a lot more slack than they think they will. But Mark's original thesis of ATP, ask the person, is exactly how one does that. Is in fact, you know, if you are uncertain about doing certain things, then actually ask, you know, what do I need to do here? And ask twice. I always say ask twice. You ask the first time, can I help you? And then when the individual says yes, then you ask again and say, great, that's terrific. How would you like me to help you? Certainly from a language point of view, there are some things one needs to learn. There are certain terms that we simply don't say anymore. Things like crippled, you wouldn't say that any longer. I'm always dismayed at media, even international media, getting it wrong in terms of referring to persons in wheelchairs as wheelchair bound and confined to a wheelchair. And I'm always very sad that hasn't come through yet, that those, it's, you know, they're almost looking at the wheelchair in a pejorative sense, and it's nothing to do with the negative. The wheelchair is not the enemy. They love the wheelchair. They don't hate the wheelchair. It's not a jail. And so it's a person, it's a wheelchair user. It's as simple as that. And so very often it's common sense, but the best route would be to ask and to lighten up a little. You can actually use a bit of humor. We're famous for having quite a lot of black humor, many of us. And so people need to actually smile a little bit more in terms of engaging with disability.
Thank you, Jeremy. Actually, another question for you, and maybe everyone can comment on this. Do you think that Rotary clubs need to have policies surrounding disability?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's well time that it's incorporated in a procedural way, that something like all attempts will be made to accommodate persons with disabilities in our club, our paperwork, and our infrastructure, something like that. So yes, I think disability definitely needs to be formally, and it certainly is. I'm very impressed, for instance, at the hard work that has been done by Rotary Learning Center it's retrospective, but it is in fact to make it more accessible. And so there's clearly an acknowledgement there, but I think it needs to be less of a tacit acknowledgement and more of an explicit one.
Mark, what are your thoughts?
I agree with Jeremy. We do need policy, but we need a balance of policy along with a lot of awareness. And for someone like myself, who's been deaf since I was born, I'm 60 years old, so I've spent 60 years of creating awareness. So, you know, we sometimes get fed up with the fact that we're still working on awareness, but it is a reality. And so what we're looking for is action. We're looking for outcomes. We're looking for people with disabilities to get into Rotary. And awareness alone is not going to do that. We do have to have specific plans, specific procedures, and so policy is important.
You hear that, everybody on the call? That is a direct challenge to you. So get out there and do the work. I'm going to hand it back over to Beth, but I'm reminded actually of a quote from a Black feminist named Audre Lorde, who says, "There's no thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives." So it's all intersectional in terms of our needs. We make things better for one person, it's probably better for lots of people. So Beth, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Leanne, and thank you to all of our participants for your excellent questions that are helping us delve into this in a very substantive manner today. As we move to the closing of our conversation, I just want to reflect on some of the insights I've gained from our wonderful panelists on this area. The first takeaway, of course, is ATP, ask the person, and Mark, thank you for that. A second takeaway is hearing from you that we really need to address our old paradigms and our old terminology. And Jeremy, thank you for helping to educate us on that. And then Marie, I really appreciate how you have laid out how inclusion benefits all of us. And it's a right of all of us to have the opportunity to fully participate. And it's just an extension of our human rights. And finally, I think that all of you mentioned how we can improve the impact of our service projects if we think through this lens in particular. We already spend a lot of money on particular projects and ideas in the education, and are we making those projects fully accessible to all of our beneficiaries is a good challenge. So when we do these webinars, we always like to have takeaways for our participants. And today, we really recommend, an action that every one of us can take is to look at our club and our community from a fresh viewpoint of accessibility. We can continue our education, and we want to say thank you to Ken Mason, who has been here with us today to help with answering questions on the chat and Q&A. Ken is one of the moderators of the Rotary Disability Advisors, and they are available to talk to any of our clubs, our districts, our zones to continue our education, as is their other educational materials. And then finally, we're in this online environment. It's simple. Let's add the closed captioning so it makes it more accessible for all of us. And so those are just some ideas of actions to take. We also have the ever expanding Rotary Resource Center on DEI, and I encourage you to explore that for resources and advice. And then our next opportunity for a webinar is coming up next month during the Rotary International Convention. Please register for RICON 21, and we will be doing a breakout session on the topic of mission inclusion, accelerating Rotary diversity, equity, and inclusion in Rotary. And that is going to be on Wednesday, July 16th, 8 a.m. Central Time. And we have excellent speakers who will be talking with us at that time. I'd now like to turn back to our speakers for a final word, 30 seconds each. And the question is, what is the one action that each of us could take to make our meetings and organizations more accessible? And Maria, 30 seconds from you.
Well, it's not an easy question. For me, the basic action that we could do is try to feel yourself with any kind of disability and think about that. How can I feel comfortable and how could I perform the best of me here? When we think about our own problem and we develop empathy for the others, everything becomes easier for us. Just
Great.
get yourself in the place of the other. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's a wonderful advice. Mark, what is your one item?
Well, I think to be aware of the sheer size and scope of the disability demographic, go out and connect, and then invite these people into your clubs. You will change their lives, but more importantly, you'll change the lives of your current club members.
Wonderful. That's great advice. And Jeremy, you get the final word here.
Thank you, Beth. Well, to me, it's simple. We simply have to apply the four-way test in the context of disability and inclusion. Is it the truth? So when we're encountered with a situation of accessibility, is it, and somebody says it is accessible, is it the truth? Interrogate that. Is it fair to all concerned? Well, how can it be fair if people are excluded? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? How sad if people are left out of those opportunities of friendships and goodwill by being excluded? And lastly, will it benefit, or will it be beneficial to all concerned? Let's ensure that all people benefit by incorporating inclusion.
Thank you, Jeremy. And using the four-way test applied to this area is, I think, very meaningful and a wonderful way for us to close out our webinar today. Our thanks to Mark, Maria, Jeremy for your insights and education to all of us on the area of disability. Our thanks to the Rotary International staff for their excellent support. We apologize if the interpretation was not working today. Sometimes we just have technical snafus and we have to get through it. And if I misspoke on the dates for the Rotary International Convention, it is in June, the month of June, and we hope to see you all in June. So thank you again for joining us today, and we'll see you next month.